Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday to you all. I'm back in my study, and we're ready to carry along with daily devotions through Redeeming Life Fellowship. And today, if you've been following along with our reading plan, you know that we've been in the Gospel of John. And today, we're going to be in John chapter 11, verses 38 through 57. 38 through 57. And as one note, first of all, I take responsibility for sort of chopping the story of Lazarus from his death to his resurrection, like right down the middle, which probably seemed to be, maybe a little bit clumsy on my part in putting together the reading plan. So in part, I'm sorry, but in other part, I'm actually not sorry, because right here at this point, we are basically at the halfway mark of the Gospel of John, which, if you'll remember, in John, basically, there's an introduction or a prologue, and then a closing or an epilogue, and that the meat of John's gospel can basically be summed up into two halves. The first half, the main body of chapters 1 through 11, has been called, rightly, I think, by many different scholars, as the book of signs, where all of Jesus' miracles are. Or at least, most of them. But I digress. And the second half, which we're about to get into beginning tomorrow, which would be called the Book of Glory, which talks about Jesus's passion and what John understands, or he records Jesus as saying that this is now the time for the Son of Man to be glorified. Whereas Jesus is going into his death, it's understood through the lens that this is the event where God is glorified through Jesus in its most profound and glorious fashion through the death of Jesus Christ. And so there's the book of the signs, book of glory, and we're right in the middle. The passage that we're going to be into is in something of a hinge upon which the whole door of John swings from one direction to the other. And what you'll find in this passage is the actual resurrection of Jesus, but then the place where, maybe a little unusually or unexpectedly, the narrative actually turns to the council of the Jewish leaders and a plot to kill Jesus, where up until this point, there have been several attempts at taking Jesus' life, which have been, for the most part, just acts almost of retaliation and defense. At this point in the narrative, as John is telling the story, the narrative turns from attacks on Jesus into calculated conspiracy against Jesus. And in that moment, which is so fascinating to me, certainly because, this is a gospel, it's about Jesus, and we hear a lot about the disciples, but it's always fascinating to me when the story turns in a direction where you don't see any Jesus, you don't see the disciples, but it's taking the direction into some place that's kind of like behind the scenes, so that in order to make sense of everything that's going on, John wants to intimate something that's going on behind the scenes, that's going on behind Jesus and his ministry, which in this case is going to reach probably not just the height of his popularity, but its height of his popularity in a particularly sensitive area, namely the city of Jerusalem, the capital of Judea, the center of religious, of Jewish politics and religion, and when Jesus starts to affect that's when the Jews, the Jewish leaders, shift their strategy from crisis management, because they've reached at this point where this crisis of Jesus of Nazareth is no longer, it's become unmanageable. And now they actually have to do away with Jesus. If they have any hopes that the way that they imagine God's purposes for them and for their entire people is going to be made manifest, it can't happen if Jesus is around. Jesus is just a wrecking ball coming crashing into Jerusalem, and they feel like they have to stop Jesus at all costs, even if it means false accusations and conspiracy to kill. So that should tell you something about how desperate the Jewish leaders are. And one of the reasons why this peek behind the narrative, into the backdrop, into the background, going behind the scenes, is actually so important. It's particularly with this. Would you agree with me that if given enough time to ponder and articulate and to just mull over it, that you could have imagine in your mind just the perfect world, where in some measure or another, the world has suddenly just fallen into its place, the stars have aligned, and things have happened and have materialized just in the same way that you expected them to happen, which is interesting because that really never happens. As much as any of us imagine the perfect world, that never actually materializes, and then we have to make compromises along the way. But that's another matter. But here's one of the things that I've come to realize is that, left to my own imperfect, selfish judgments, if it were left to me to make a perfect world, that my image and my vision for what a perfect world would look like, as I stand here and now, would not be the same perfect world as God imagines it. That in some way or another, whatever image that I have of this perfect world, that if everything were right, it would look just like this, that image and that picture, I have to admit, is not the same picture that God sees. There are some, probably, I guess I would hope, certain resemblances in the way in which, as God is changing my heart slowly and sanctifying me and my imagination and my thoughts and my ambitions, that slowly but surely God is changing my vision and my understanding of what a perfect world would look like to correspond to his. But as it stands right now, the way that I would imagine the perfect world needs divine correction. As it stands right now, the perfect world I imagine really is not so perfect. Eventually, Jesus is going to have to come into my life, and he's going to make changes to what my vision for a perfect world is. And at that point, I'm going to have to make a decision. Am I going to listen and yield to what Jesus's plans and his purposes, or am I going to hold on stubbornly to my own? What we'll see happen in the second half of this passage is an instance where the Jewish leaders would not yield to what it is that Jesus is doing, and they're holding on stubbornly to their own image and their own hopes of what a perfect world would look like. And this is just the thought that I want to sort of plant in your mind as we sit down to read a passage like this today. So, without further ado, let's jump into John chapter 11, beginning in verse 38. And it says this: Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and his feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Therefore, Many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and who had seen what Jesus did put their faith in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. "What are we accomplishing?" they asked. "Here is this man performing many miraculous signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up. "You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than for the whole nation perish." He did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation, and not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. So from that day, they plotted to take his life. Therefore, Jesus no longer moved about publicly among the Jews. Instead, he withdrew to a region near the desert, to a village called Ephraim, where he stayed with his disciples. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, many went up from the country to Jerusalem to their ceremonial cleansing before the Passover. They kept looking for Jesus as they stood in the temple area and asked one another, "What do you think? Isn't he coming to the feast at all?" But the chief priests and Pharisees had given orders that if anyone found out where Jesus was, he should report it so that they might arrest him. And that's where the book of signs closes and the book of glory is about to begin. And it's remarkable to me, certainly, that how God would use somebody like Caiaphas to prophesy, even unwittingly, that Jesus was going to die for the people. In other words, what Caiaphas thinks is that his death is what's going to secure the stability of the nation of Israel. And what he cannot foresee is that when Jesus dies, that what he's doing is not just to save national Israel, but he's doing so in a way that's going to actually save the people of God by affording atonement for their sins. And not just rescuing the people of God, but creating anew the people of God through a covenant in his blood. And which is, frankly, it's a picture and it's an idea of a perfect world where God has done whatever it takes to save your life and mine, that the Jews themselves would not want anything to do with. That in their image of a perfect world, Jesus has nothing to do with it. And I think for a lot of us, when Jesus gets a little too close for comfort and his demands upon our life become too strong, we say, "God, this is not a part of my image of a perfect world, and I'd rather have you out. As a matter of fact, you can stay as far away as possible, and the closer you get, the closer that I'm going to want to stamp you out." And even as Christians, we resist Jesus's claims upon our lives that his will and his plans are actually the best for us, but that we can't really trust him because we're so satisfied and determined by fulfilling our wills for a perfect world. And whatever your image of a perfect world is, will always be secondary, always be less than in light of God's perfect world. And so each and every one of us have the decision, as C.S. Lewis put it once again, that in the end, there's only going to be two types of people. Those to whom say to God, "Thy will be done," or those to whom God says, "Thy will be done." And I don't want to settle for anything less than second best. And if that's true, that means in whatever fashion necessary, I have to lay aside my dreams and my vision for a perfect world and say, God, this vision is nothing in comparison to what you have in store. And I would much rather be a part of what you have in store than by clinging to my own vision and destroying everybody else in my process of pursuing it. But thankfully, thank God that even in instances like this, where the Jews are hell-bent on pursuing their own dreams, that even then, those were not powerful enough to be able to triumph the purposes of God. And so let's set our hearts on God's vision for a perfect world and yield to him and to put him first in all we say and do. Because that is, in essence, what discipleship and growing mature disciples is all about. So with that, thank you so much for joining us. If you haven't, subscribed to the YouTube channel so you can get daily notifications. You can also check out our podcast. You can find ways to support us with our church plant here in Whitley County, because we're not giving up on this call that God has put on our lives to be able to grow mature disciples and see to it that God's kingdom will come and his will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so with that, we say amen, and I pray God would bless you, and I'm really looking forward to the next time we're all going to be able to meet together in person. So God bless you. Take care. I'll see you next time.